G'day legends, I hope that you're having a fantastic day and a fantastic Friday. Now, as my Sergeant Major used to say on every Friday, have a good weekend, but don't add or subtract to the population. And if you end up in jail, assert dominance quickly. Anyway, legends, we have a fair bit to go over today actually, but not as much as yesterday and the day before. I know we've had some very long videos, I apologize, but we're going to look at the maps. We're going to look at some new fighter aircraft. We're going to talk about what Putin said yesterday. We need to talk about what the UK and a Dutch leading soldier has said as well about the situation, not only in Ukraine, but also globally. We'll look at Zelensky has made a decision on a high-ranking special forces leader as well. And I want to talk about a little bit of tax. But where we'll start is, of course, yesterday, May 9th, was Victory Day. And we saw large celebrations and memorials all throughout Russia. And these actually seemingly went off without a hitch. I think many, including I, were holding our breath for some event to happen. We had no idea what, but we'd had a lot of warnings leading up to this. Now, as I said yesterday, and I'll always say, I see no issue at all with having a day of remembrance for Red Army veterans. The sacrifice those men gave was unmatched by any other nation in the Second World War. And of course, this includes soldiers from Ukraine and other post-Soviet states. As Ernest Hemingway said, anyone who loves freedom owes such a debt to the Red Army that it can never be repaid. Yes, the West gave lend-lease and equipment and all this, but at the end of the day, the sacrifice of men was given by the Red Army. Millions upon millions upon millions, while themselves living under the tyrannical rule of Stalin. Now, what I will say about this is I hate the politicization of any day of memorial, whether it is this, whether it is Anzac Day, whether it is anyone else throughout the world. And we have seen in years, Russia has politicized this day to justify what they call the special military operation, the invasion into Ukraine. As we have seen, then this conflict politicized Soviet memorials and monuments as well throughout post-Soviet states, which lay tribute and memorial to those who fought in post-Soviet states. Of course, with many of those states, their own men going to fight, and we have seen many memorials ripped down throughout Eastern Europe. Now, let's actually have a look at what Putin has said on parade yesterday. Now, this isn't the full thing. You can find his full speech on kremlin.ru if you'd like to have a look. Today, we're witnessing attempts to distort the truth about World War II. This truth is a sore for those who have developed a habit of basing their effectively colonial policy on duplicity and lies. They are tearing down memorials to those who have really fought Nazism, erecting monuments to traitors and Hitler's accomplices, and erasing the memory of heroism and noble spirit of the liberators and the great sacrifice they made for the sake of all life on Earth. We reject exceptionalist claims of any country or alliance. We know what this unchecked ambition may lead to. Russia will do utmost to avoid a global confrontation, but it will not allow itself to be threatened. Our strategic forces, this meaning nuclear, are always in combat readiness. And of course, in these parades, we see nuclear weapons then paraded. Russia is now going through a difficult watershed moment in its history. The fate of our motherland and its future depends on us. We are celebrating Victory Day against the backdrop of the special military operation. All of those engaging on the front lines are our heroes. We humbled by your fortitude and self-sacrifice. All of Russia stands with you. So, of course, this day has become politicized both ways about what it is actually meant to be standing for of those in World War II, but using to talk about the operation here, or we see in others to reject what happened back then and remove memorials. And I am vehemently against the removal of any war memorial, even if it has just now fallen out of fad. Now, let's have a look at the maps, I guess, early on. And of course, we have Ukraine, the center, the capital of Kyiv. Red areas occupied since 22, the purple since 14, and the green where Russia has been at some point and either has been pushed back or has withdrawn. Now, a lot of people liked what I said yesterday about this map drip feeding. Now, what did I mean by this? We know many areas on this map from Robotny, Krasnoyarivka, Avdiivka look significantly different to what it does on here. Now, we know this map is very, very pro-Ukrainian, has signed deals with the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense. So comes under the umbrella of the informational space of the war as well. What I think is happening here is drip feeding in updates every couple of days, so an update in the north and an update in the east, because it is playing into not wanting to show a massive amount of ground taken at one point on multiple fronts. That is what I think the tact here is. The problem with this is at some point it does need to then catch up. So it is going to have to show large movements at some point. We know Robotny has been ignored now for weeks and weeks. Krasnoyarivka is ignored. Umansk will look at geolocated footage today that is not even in grey zone, as well as the only piece of movement up in the north. So I think there is a drip feed of information coming in on this map. Anyway, let's then talk about some information that I was then sent across about then the Avdiivka front, and I guess a little bit of the war overall, a trusted friend of mine. So, driving from Karlivka to Netelovy, there is a left turnoff going north. So, Karlivka, Netelovy, this left turn up here, what connects then, of course, to Ulmansk. We'll talk about that in a second. Seeing that junction cut off is a massive pain in the ass. If time is the most valuable commodity, then we will need more time to plan. Don't need to be there right now to know what's going on. MLRS to mortar range was my playground. It's those assets that we've been so desperately short of that will now require even more time to move pieces on a chessboard. We know with mortars there was a case of corruption up to $40 million, and I think it was something over 100,000 mortar shells as well that never arrived. Anyway, call it tactical or area attrition, Russia will continue to gain advantage in options, position, and time, unless something really juicy comes to the front soon. Ukraine's time and options of firing positions will continue to diminish. Pure speculation on my part, I think this will continue until we have an event similar to when we ran out of Lysychansk, although less dramatic and costly. We will pull so far back, and like that, summer will be a very calm 2 weeks plus. Artillery will fire as a mere token at gentlemanly hours. So we saw this if you were in Ukraine pre-2022, when the OSCE observers left in the afternoon, there'd be some firing of artillery back and forward. When it starts again, Ukraine will be more stacked up, I hope, and that will be a stable line a long time. So talking about there will be a fallback here somewhere, and then that line will then stabilize for a rest for both Ukraine and Russia, such as the line along Seversk to Bakhmut was. Now, this is an important line. So this line between Bakhmut and Seversk up in here has been stable for a long time, but if we look back at then only yesterday, it is moving here, trickle feeding in those updates. But just a theory from a guy who knows the terrain and what's behind it. Now on both sides of the line, of course, because the line has moved through. So without better ado, let's have a look at Avdiivka. And where we need to come down is, of course, into Ulmansk. And I have a little bit of footage to show you here. On Victory Day, we see then, let's mute this flag, then flown over a monument here in Ulmansk. So where is this geolocated to? So Noel Reports has put this right in here. So over this side of the road where this dips down. So just inside what is said to be grey zone. But if we take red zone to here, 2.7, the best part of 3 kilometers behind where they are saying where the Russian line actually is. And you can see Noel Reports has actually caught up on this, and you can see the front line sitting a fair bit further east than the MOD map here is showing. So then, of course, we have a Suryak map update. Now, where we will first look is then the Ulmansk front. It's northwest Donetsk city. Russian army captured all the eastern defenses of Ulmansk and captured half of the village. In addition, troops reached Netelovy Road, taking control over a series of positions there. Now, of course, this is just down to the south here, where my friend was talking about. Moreover, Russian forces continue reducing the salient south of Pervomayski. So Pervomayski, Nevelsky in here, so talking down in here that this is getting closed more and more up. And then we can see out from Nefyadov to Urmansk that a movement through here. You can see this like seat-looking paddock, that this paddock has come under control by Suryak's map. Now, I get that different maps have different biases. Again, this is why we show multiple maps. So the only other updates we have on this map is the only update for today we have on this entire map is a tiny sliver then made up here. So near Sinkivka, this is the only update for MOD map today, when we know there's been others. This is what I'm talking about, of my belief of trickle feeding in bits of information, so you don't just have one whole, but at some point it needs to catch up, because they're not going to be able to hide it like Krasnoyarivka, like Urmansk, and there's going to have to be large movements made, which of course can backfire. Propaganda is great until then it starts backfiring. So NOAA reports is showing very similar to then this map here today, but showing a lot more up into the industrial zone, right? That is sitting in grey zone, or some not even in grey zone up in here, but on the eastern side, similar-ish to the MOD map. Therefore, let's have a look at Suryak map's update. Now, this is showing significantly different here, showing much further push in on this eastern side of Krasnoyarivka, and a much more northerly push, areas which are not in grey zone and areas under control here. During the last 48 hours, Russian army made new advances in Krasnoyarivka. From northern axis, troops reached the central hospital of Marinka and agricultural school. Currently, Russians are advancing eastwards along this street. Only 700 meters remain between the northern and southern groups. As a result, Ukrainian army began the withdrawal from the trench system. So 700 meters between where these two groups are sitting. Furthermore, saying this, although there is still no physical encirclement of the eastern zone, the Russian army has fire control over all escape routes. Ukrainian troops are having difficulty leaving their positions. We are likely to see surrenders here. So this, down in here, very, very dangerous place to currently be. Now, we know Ukraine has a large issue with getting enough weapons and enough supplies from aid from the West. And of course, money-wise in Ukraine, there isn't much buying of, I guess, their own weapons to come in that isn't aid. But Ukraine has, comparatively to countries around the world, a very, very low flat tax rate of 18% personal income tax. Now, of course, wages are lower, things are cheaper, and everything is relative. But when we compare to somewhere like, say, Australia, America, where we have a sliding tax rate that you'll pay this at one level and then up and up, to highest rates in Australia being somewhere near 47%, if you include then Medicare on top of that. But what I was going to say about this is, could there be some tax freed up with, say, if you're a Ukrainian who earns over, just put it high, like 100,000 USD. You earn over 100,000 USD, up the tax rate for that. So you're talking politicians who are earning, around that, leading businessmen, and some of the OnlyFans girls online we see monetizing the war and then driving Porsches in Dubai. But I just thought about this, like, could there be, high, so it won't affect 99% of people. You have $100,000, $150,000, but it's affecting that top 1%, put in some money back in to help the economy and help buy more military or whatever, what taxes they're to do. And I hate taxes, don't get me wrong, it's bullshit. The taxes are for wartime, and that is incredibly low. It's actually lower than the tax being paid on the money to then go to Ukraine. Anyway, I spoke about Zelensky had fired someone. So Zelensky has replaced Special Operations Chief for a second time in 6 months. The dismissal of Colonel Lupachuk and appointment of Brigadier General Toprak in his place was announced in 2 decrees on the president's website, provided no explanation for the move. Of course, we've seen a lot of replacements in the upper echelon of the Ukrainian forces, and we've speculated about what could that actually then be. Now, UAC, who of course build a lot of Russian aircraft, including civilian and military aircraft, have posted a video and this of delivery of new Su-35S aircraft to the Ministry of Defence. They are manufactured at this plant. Multi-role fighters of the 4++ gen of Su-35s underwent cycle of ground and flight tests in various modes and then flew to where will be their home base. The aviation plant has reached a rhythmic pace of aircraft production within the framework of the current year program. This is the second batch of combat vehicles sent to the Russian Aerospace Forces. Smolensk residents fulfill their obligations to supply new aircraft on time and are working on creating batches of Su-35 and Su-57, so the Gen 4 plus Gen 5 aircraft serial fighters. Now, in this video that has released, so they never give numbers of how many, which is no surprise. Everyone would do that. But we can see that it's at least 2, but we don't know how many. Normally in these videos, we do see 2. So it could be more, could be, well, we just at least 2, but we see then that taking off there. Regardless of your view on this war, you cannot deny that the Su-35, Su-27, MiG-29s are beautiful aircraft. What we need is Lockheed engineers, Russian designers of aircraft. Then we can build a beautiful aircraft that doesn't look like F-35, but with all the technological aspect. But I think we're a long way off that ever occurring. So let's talk about, I guess, the global situation, shells a little bit of everything. And one thing we need to point out is the industrial base struggling. So just for instance, let's have a look at this. Now, I know this isn't the best example in the world, but it still is an example. The EU acknowledged on Wednesday, 31st of January, the bloc will fall short of the promised 1 million artillery rounds. Stands at 524,000 shells, roughly 52% of its target. So fell incredibly short of that, and it's going to take a long time to pump up this industrial base. When, at the same time, we see North Korea, by RUSI estimates, have sent somewhere in the vicinity of 1 million ammunition shells and Grad rockets. This is something that this war has shown us, is our global production in the West is just not at the amount anywhere near what's needed for a larger scale war. And I'll remind you that this war is currently between the east of Ukraine and Russia. We would run out of shells, or would have run out of shells, depending on where our industrial capacity actually is now. And I don't believe it's much better. It is better, but still being used up very quickly. We would have problems straight off the bat of just dumb weapons. Yeah, we've got F-35s, we've got F-22s and this and that. But what this war has shown us is at the end of the day, who's got the most bullets and bombs and men will start advancing on the battlefield. And Ukraine, yes, they've asked for some high-tech weapons, but what they are begging for is just more kit, just more shells on the front. Anyway, let's have a look over some of this, and this will all tie back into itself. So top NATO soldier Rob Bauer warned the world will be very restless for another 15 years. Now, I'm a few days late on this. It's May 7th. Regardless, it is not too late for Ukraine. The Russians have made progress, but it is still quite limited and still not strategic. I don't know what he means by not strategic. I think it depends how far you zoom in and out on what is strategic, what is not. Zelensky has said only today that Ukraine could stop the advancement and could advance if enough weapons are given him. But I personally believe the biggest problem for Ukraine is not weapons. It's actually manpower behind those weapons. You can give whatever you want, but you need men. And we know there's a lot of problems with that. Currently, I don't know how it's going to be fixed. I know I'm a broken record on that. But saying the most important thing is that we continue to send aid. And the longer the war lasts, the more difficult that becomes. Many countries have been supplying weapons and ammunition from their own stocks for 2 years, but they are not endless either. We can do two things: dig even deeper into our own supplies and push even harder on the defence industry to produce much more and faster. Continuing. It will probably take at least a year to fully achieve increased production in the West. We will have to bridge that period so that Ukraine can prepare for the next counter-offensive. So we've been hearing, whether it's from the US, from this, alluding to a 2025 counter-offensive, which is still at minimum a whole year away. It'd be interesting to see where the border and where Russia's defensive works and where Russia's industrial capacity are by then. And it's not going to get easier on the front line. It's going to get dug in more and more. But that will not be easy. There are 450,000 Russians in the occupied part of Ukraine. Now, speaking about, I guess, more globally here, It does not mean the war will start tomorrow, but it will be a very unsettled for the next 15 years because those tectonic plates of power are shifting in the world as we hear more and more the rise of the global south. And things like this war, what's happening in Gaza, are pushing those countries further together, especially because of sanctions. Sanctions, yes, they affect Russia, but it also then, in a state like that, people look for where they can backfill that. And they've looked, of course, into the south. I think it's important that people start to realize that it's not necessarily a far-fetched show. So, of course, then we have like Russia here, and this will link in with the next bit. The success of Russia's information warfare in the global south, while not absolute, is undeniable. It is managing to leverage various existing historical grievances and disillusionment of Western policies, often justified to shape perceptions and public opinion in its favour. And I can see why countries in Africa, which, you know, the West has had influence and money and this and that, and not much has improved, are looking to someone else, as well as what's not spoken about here is the reliance on Western markets is decreasing around the world. And this is why I talk about, I think, freezing those assets from Russia and using, you know, money off the top, whatever. But if you were to freeze it, liquidate that and send it in, and you undermine the euro, pound, dollar, I think that long term is a very, very slippery slope and a bad idea. Now, Foreign Secretary David Cameron, of course, out of the UK, has had his first large speech. But returning to frontline politics, what stands out to me is how many reasons are found for us not to act. It too often feels as if the fundamental change in the world has not yet been met with the fundamental change in how many in the free world are thinking and acting. People claiming we have become too weak, not powerful enough militarily or effective enough economically, or those who won't act. So fixated are they on risks, be it escalation, unintended consequences, legal jeopardy, or simply causing offence. So we've seen, of course, the UK in the past couple of weeks saying that their weapons can be used inside Russia, where others are saying they cannot. And of course, the UK has really stepped up to support Ukraine economically, militarily, and of course, administratively with Boris in the first weeks of the war, and some interesting bits and pieces that happen there. But people fixating on risk of escalation, unintended consequences, well, I think people are looking over and saying that is a nuclear power with thousands of warheads and we don't have interceptors to hit them. I think that is, and that always needs to come into the equation at high level politics. People are thinking that. I think the longer the war goes on, more people will think that. While, as the Prime Minister said in Warsaw recently, an axis of authoritarian states like Russia, Iran, North Korea and China is increasingly acting together, like we spoke about this rise, in attempts to undermine us and our allies and the world order which we depend. Now, I'm not saying that acting together to undermine us is incorrect. That is definitely something which countries absolutely do. But you need to remember too that we've also pushed these states together. We sanction China, we sanction Iran, we sanction Russia, we sanction North Korea. Well, are they not going to then just do trade together? And I think the big one in this that they forget to mention is then India. Massive population, massive developing, and where will their alliances sit with economic, military, all of that? I know we're all trying to build that, but that in decades to come will be a huge, huge question. We must be bolder in combating their poisonous methods of deceit. That's what Britain and America did by publicising of our intelligence before Putin's illegal invasion. It was an unprecedented step and made it absolutely clear what Putin was planning to do, assault a neighbour without a scrap of justification. Now, I was in Ukraine when the initial invasion 22 went down. Well, the 22 invasion, not 2014. But that said, we didn't have that much intelligence of what was actually, no one really knew what was happening. And I believe that if they knew, they should have released it to people earlier so more civilians could actually then leave those areas, that we didn't know what was happening the night before, regardless of the day then of. Now, we hear this more and more without a scrap of justification. Now, this can be both right and wrong at the same time. It's how you perceive it. But when you're talking about a nuclear power who shares a border with, I guess, the rest of Europe and eventually NATO, with the ambition to bring Ukraine into NATO, you still need to screw your head on at some point as a foreign diplomat, secretary, whatever, and go, how will they see this as? Do they see this as a threat? And It doesn't mean then you change your decisions on this, but you need to take into account that at some point. Exactly the same as if Russia or China wanted to put a base in Mexico, or when Russia or Soviet Union talked about Cuba, how we then perceived that. Anyway, we in the West need to undermine and expose the malign networks that Russia uses to spread its lies. Our adversaries also strive to undermine global trusts in these beliefs and principles by attacking our own record. They gleefully accuse the West of double standards. I think we should be frank in our response. Yes, the suffering in Gaza is appalling, but an unprovoked war against an independent country like Ukraine that poses no threat is wholly different from the conflict that has grown from the brutal attacks of the 7th of October. And many, many people will point at this and call out double standards. Now, whether they're right or wrong, again, regardless, you need to look at how people are feeling and how other leaders will see this. We know that Israel's bombing campaign has killed more civilians in a few months in Gaza than Russia's bombing campaign into Ukraine has killed. Regardless of the side of that, regardless of what was what, you need to see how billions of people around the world are seeing this as we are pushing those countries closer together from policy, economic, military aspects. We're pushing them together from our stuff. That it ties back into what Admiral Bauer is saying here about very unsettled for the next 15 years because the tectonic plates of power are shifting in the world. And I think we need to get more and more used to the idea that the West, from the end of the Second World War to 2015, and that period we had where we were dominant in every aspect, that it is starting to then decrease in many, many ways, and that our global dominance of things could potentially be challenged in aspects. I don't think there'll be a flip for a very long time, if there even is. But from this to this is looking more and more likely. And things like this war, what's happening in Gaza, have sped that up exponentially. Anyway, legends. Sorry if there's a lot of cuts in this one. I couldn't talk. Look after yourselves. I'll see you soon. Thanks. Bye-bye.